The Zephyrian Consortium had perfected the art of acquisition for 7,000 cycles. Across 43 sectors of known space, they had catalogued, categorized, and claimed every species worth claiming. Their methodical approach was legendary among the trade guilds: identify species with valuable traits, establish superiority through technological demonstration, integrate the species into the consortium's hierarchical structure. It was efficient. It was profitable. It had never failed. Until they encountered humanity. The initial survey reports from the Sol system were promising. The bipedal mammals showed remarkable adaptability, decent intelligence ratings, and, most importantly, a seemingly natural tendency towards social stratification. Their own history was littered with examples of submission to authority, acceptance of caste systems, and willingness to be governed by those they perceived as superior. The Zephyrian analysis teams were confident this would be another straightforward integration. Commander Vexthali reviewed the preliminary data as her ship entered Earth's outer atmosphere. The humans had detected their approach weeks ago but had made no aggressive moves, another positive indicator. Their technological level was primitive by consortium standards, roughly equivalent to what the Zephyrians had achieved 3 millennia prior. The mathematical certainty was overwhelming: Earth would become the 44th member world of the consortium, and humanity would find their designated place in the cosmic order. The landing site was carefully chosen, a large open area outside one of their major population centers, clearly visible but non-threatening. Standard protocol called for a demonstration of superior technology, followed by communication with local authorities, then negotiation of terms. Vexthali had overseen 17 such integrations. Each had followed the same predictable pattern. The humans gathered in impressive numbers as the Zephyrian vessel settled onto the designated coordinates. Their primitive communication networks buzzed with activity, transmitting images and commentary across their global information systems. Perfect. The more witnesses to consortium superiority, the smoother the integration process would be. Vexthali emerged from the ship accompanied by her diplomatic contingent, their advanced environmental suits shimmering with energy fields that would be clearly visible to human observation equipment. She activated the universal translator and stepped forward to address the crowd of humans who had gathered at what they considered a safe distance. People of Earth, her amplified voice carried across the open space, automatically translating into the dominant local language. I am Commander Vexthali of the Zephyrian Consortium. We come as representatives of a vast alliance of worlds that spans the galaxy. We have observed your species and find you adequate for membership in our organization. The response was immediate and unexpected. Instead of the odd silence that typically greeted such announcements, the human crowd erupted into a cacophony of voices. Some seemed excited, others fearful, but a disturbing number appeared to be laughing. Vexthali consulted her cultural database. Laughter in this context suggested either extreme nervousness or, more troublingly, amusement at what they perceived as absurd. A small group of humans approached, apparently official representatives based on their formal attire and the deference shown by the surrounding crowd. The lead figure, an older human with graying hair and weathered features, stepped forward with what Vexthali's behavioral analysis software identified as confident body language. "Welcome to Earth," the human said. "I'm Secretary General Morrison of the United Nations. We appreciate your visit. But I'm afraid we have some questions about your proposal." Questions. Not immediate acceptance, not odd submission, but questions. Vexthali felt the first stirrings of unease. "Proceed with your inquiries, though I assure you that membership in the consortium represents the optimal outcome for your species." The optimal outcome according to whom? Morrison asked. "You've determined we're adequate for membership, but you haven't asked if we want to be members. Don't you think that's something we should decide for ourselves?" The universal translator struggled with the concept the human was expressing. Self-determination in the face of obvious superiority was not a recognized behavioral pattern in the consortium database. Vexthali recalibrated her approach. "Secretary General Morrison, perhaps there is confusion regarding our respective positions. The Zephyrian Consortium represents the pinnacle of galactic civilization. Our technology exceeds yours by orders of magnitude. Our knowledge spans countless worlds and cultures. Integration into our structure provides your species with guidance, protection, and purpose. These are not matters for debate. Morrison nodded slowly, but his expression suggested thoughtfulness rather than acceptance. I see. And, in this integration, what would humanity's role be? Your species shows aptitude for labor-intensive tasks, creative problem-solving under resource constraints, and adaptation to hostile environments. These traits would be valuable in our mining operations, terraforming projects, and exploration initiatives. You would serve according to your capabilities. Serve, Morrison repeated. So we would be servants. You would fulfill your optimal function within the consortium hierarchy. Each species contributes according to their strengths. This is the natural order. The human leader was quiet for a long moment, and Vexthali allowed herself to believe she was witnessing the moment of acceptance that marked successful integration. Then, Morrison smiled, and somehow that expression was more unsettling than any display of anger would have been. Commander, I think you fundamentally misunderstood something about humanity. Let me share a quote from one of our philosophers: "The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others." Do you know what that means? Vexthali's analysis systems worked frantically to parse the statement. I do not see the relevance of primitive philosophy to practical integration procedures. It means, Morrison continued, that humans have spent our entire history learning to reject the idea that we're meant to be owned. We've overthrown kings, abolished slavery, dismantled empires, and fought wars against anyone who tried to tell us we existed to serve their purposes. The weak self that accepts subjugation, we've been killing that part of ourselves for thousands of years. The crowd behind Morrison had grown larger and more organized. Vexthali noticed they had arranged themselves in patterns that suggested coordination rather than random gathering. Her threat assessment systems activated, though she could detect no weapons technology capable of threatening her vessel. Your historical conflicts are irrelevant, she stated. You fought among yourselves because you had no proper guidance. The consortium offers structure, purpose, and an end to such chaos. Does it? Morrison asked. Or does it offer a more sophisticated form of the same domination we've been rejecting all along? He gestured to his companions. Commander, meet Dr. Sarah Chan, our foremost expert on artificial intelligence and autonomous systems. Professor James Okafor, whose work on distributed networks has revolutionized our communication systems. General Elena Vasquez, who has spent her career studying asymmetric warfare and resistance movements. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, whose experience with space-based systems exceeds anyone else on our planet. Each human stepped forward as they were introduced, and Vexthali found herself facing a group whose confidence seemed entirely disproportionate to their technological limitations. Dr. Chen spoke first. We've been analyzing your ship systems since you entered our atmosphere. Impressive technology, certainly, but not incomprehensible. Your approach relies on overwhelming technological superiority to establish dominance. It's an old pattern, one we've seen throughout our own history. Professor Okafor continued the thought. What's interesting is how rigid your systems appear to be. Very hierarchical, very centralized. That makes them powerful, but also predictable. And predictable systems have vulnerabilities. General Vasquez smiled with an expression that made Vexthali's security protocols surge to high alert. We've had time to study your approach, Commander. 43 worlds integrated using essentially the same methodology. Always the same pattern: technological demonstration, negotiations with existing authorities, integration of local power structures into your hierarchy. It's very orderly. Captain Tanaka nodded toward the Zephyrian ship. The question we've been asking ourselves is, what happens when you encounter a species that doesn't want to be orderly? What happens when your standard protocols meet a people who have made chaos into an art form? Vexthali felt the conversation slipping beyond her prepared parameters. The humans were not responding according to any known pattern. Their confidence in the face of obvious superiority suggested either delusion or information she lacked. Your species cannot seriously contemplate resistance, she said. The technological differential alone makes such considerations irrelevant. We could disable your planet's infrastructure from orbit if necessary. Could you? Morrison asked mildly. Without damaging the very resources you came here to exploit? Without destroying the workforce you want to integrate? Commander, the problem with overwhelming force is that it's binary, you either use it or you don't. And, if you use it, you lose what you came for. Dr. Chen stepped forward. We've been in contact with some of your previous integration targets, Commander. Did you know that 17 of your member species have been developing autonomous communication networks outside your official channels? They've been very interested in sharing information about consortium vulnerabilities. The statement hit Vexthali like a physical blow. Hidden communication networks among integrated species was a scenario that had never appeared in consortium planning documents. The possibility that subject worlds might be coordinating resistance activities represented a threat to the fundamental structure of their organization. That is impossible, she declared. Consortium monitoring systems would detect any unauthorized communications. Professor Okafor smiled. Would they? We've been transmitting on quantum-entangled frequencies your systems can't even detect, let alone monitor. The network's been active for almost 3 Earth years now. Turns out a lot of species didn't appreciate being integrated as much as you assumed. General Vasquez added her own disturbing revelation. What we learned from them is that the consortium is incredibly effective at integrating planets that want to be integrated, or can be convinced to accept integration. But, you've never faced a sustained resistance movement. Your security doctrine assumes compliance. Captain Tanaka gestured toward the sky. Right now, there are 17 human vessels in your ship's blind spots, and another 43 moving toward your staging areas in the outer system. They're primitive by your standards, but they're armed with weapons designed specifically to exploit the vulnerabilities your former victims were kind enough to share with us. Vexthali's command circuits fired off urgent status requests to her ship and the fleet positioned beyond Earth's orbit. The responses were concerning. Multiple vessels were reporting system anomalies. Navigation computers were experiencing cascade failures. Communication arrays were offline across half the fleet. You're bluffing, she said, though her certainty was evaporating. Primitive weapons cannot affect consortium technology. Dr. Chen held up a small device that looked like nothing more than a metallic cube. This is a quantum virus, Commander. It was developed using specifications provided by your former subjects. It targets the specific quantum encryption protocols your systems use for intership communication. We've been seeding it through your fleet's networks since the moment you arrived. The tactical implications crashed over Vexthali like a wave. Without quantum communications, the fleet could not coordinate. Without coordination, their technological superiority meant nothing. Individual ships were powerful, but isolation made them vulnerable to swarm tactics. Morrison stepped closer, his expression still maddeningly calm. Here's what's going to happen, Commander. You and your people are going to return to your ship. You're going to leave our system. And you're going to carry a message back to the consortium leadership. What message? Vexthali asked, though she dreaded the answer. That humanity chooses its own path. That we will never accept the role of servants in someone else's empire. That any attempt to force integration will be met with resistance that makes your previous encounters look like polite disagreements. Morrison's voice hardened. And that we're not alone anymore. Every species you've integrated has received a copy of the quantum virus specifications. Some of them are very interested in renegotiating their membership terms. The full scope of the disaster became clear to Vexthali. This was not simply a failed integration. This was the emergence of a resistance movement that could destabilize the entire consortium. The humans had not merely rejected their offer, they had weaponized that rejection and spread it to other worlds. The consortium will not tolerate this disruption, she warned. Larger fleets will come. More advanced countermeasures will be developed. General Vasquez laughed, and the sound was genuinely frightening. Commander, you still don't understand. We're not trying to defeat your technology. We're trying to change the game entirely. Every ship you send gives us more systems to study, more networks to infiltrate, more opportunities to spread resistance protocols. The harder you push, the stronger the opposition becomes. Dr. Chen nodded. It's a fundamental principle of distributed systems, Commander. The network becomes more resilient as it grows. Each node you try to suppress creates new pathways for information flow. You built an empire based on centralized control, but you've just encountered a culture that specializes in distributed resistance. Professor Okafor held up his own device, similar to Dr. Chen's quantum virus but somehow more ominous. This contains everything we've learned about consortium technology, plus detailed specifications for manufacturing quantum viruses, communication networks, and resistance protocols. It's being transmitted simultaneously to over 300 locations across 43 star systems. Even if you destroyed Earth right now, the information would survive and spread. Captain Tanaka added the final blow. And, Commander? We've been recording this entire conversation. Every species in the galaxy is going to know that the mighty Zephyrian Consortium was turned away by a single primitive world. How do you think that's going to affect your reputation among potential integration targets? Vexthali felt the foundations of everything she understood about galactic politics shifting beneath her. The consortium's power had always rested on the assumption of inevitable victory. Technological superiority plus demonstrated success equaled compliance from lesser species. But, if that equation could be broken, if resistance was possible and could spread, the implications were staggering. Integrated worlds demanding renegotiation. New species refusing even preliminary contact. The careful hierarchy that held the consortium together beginning to fracture along lines of resentment that had been building for millennia. Morrison seemed to read her thoughts. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, Commander. Humanity destroyed the part of ourselves that accepted subjugation long ago. And, now we're going to help the rest of the galaxy do the same thing. The crowd of humans had been growing throughout the conversation, and Vexthali now realized they were not simply observers. They were coordinated, organized, and displaying a level of confidence that suggested extensive preparation. This had not been a spontaneous response to first contact. This had been a planned resistance operation from the moment humanity detected the approaching consortium fleet. How long have you been preparing for this? She asked. Morrison smiled. Since the moment we detected your monitoring probes 5 years ago. Did you think we wouldn't notice? Commander, we've been watching you study us. We've been studying you right back. And, we've been talking to every species you've ever contacted. Some of them were very eager to share their experiences with consortium integration. Dr. Chen stepped forward again. What you need to understand is that this isn't just about humanity rejecting integration. This is about fundamentally changing the relationship between advanced and developing civilizations. The old model of technological superiority equals automatic dominance is over. General Vasquez nodded toward her companions. We're offering something new. Voluntary cooperation between equals. Shared knowledge without coercion. Trade relationships based on mutual benefit rather than extraction. It's a radical concept for someone from your background, I know. Professor Okafor held up his communication device. Every conversation, every exchange, every piece of information flows freely through the network. No central authority controlling access. No hierarchy determining who gets to know what. Just open exchange between sovereign peoples. Captain Tanaka gestured toward the assembled crowd. These aren't subjects waiting for integration, Commander. They're citizens of an independent world that chooses its own relationships with other species. And, they're part of a growing movement that's going to transform how business gets done in this galaxy. Vexthali's analysis systems were struggling to process the implications. The human model of organization was alien to everything the consortium understood about effective governance. Without clear hierarchy, without centralized control, how could complex operations be coordinated? How could order be maintained?
How could progress be achieved? But the evidence was undeniable.
The humans had somehow coordinated a massive resistance operation involving dozens of worlds and sophisticated technological development, all without the kind of centralized command structure the consortium considered essential. They had created what appeared to be organized chaos, and somehow made it functional. Morrison stepped closer, his voice taking on a more serious tone.
Commander, I want you to take a message back to your superiors.
Tell them that humanity is willing to engage in diplomatic relations with the consortium as equals. We're interested in trade, cultural exchange, and cooperative exploration of space. But we will never accept integration into your hierarchy, and we will actively assist any other species that wants to leave that hierarchy. The Consortium Council will never accept such terms, Vexthali protested. The entire structure of our civilization depends on orderly integration of member worlds. Dr. Chen shrugged. Then, I guess you'll have to decide whether your civilization is worth preserving if it can only exist by enslaving others. That's not our problem to solve for you, Commander. The casual dismissal was perhaps the most shocking aspect of the entire encounter. The humans were not pleading for mercy, not negotiating for better terms within the consortium structure, not even particularly angry about the integration attempt. They were simply dismissing it as irrelevant to their chosen path forward. General Vasquez checked a device on her wrist. Commander, you have approximately 1 hour before the quantum virus completely disables your fleet's coordination systems. I'd recommend beginning your departure preparations soon. The window for orderly withdrawal is closing rapidly. Professor Okafor added his own timeline pressure. And, Commander? The resistance network goes active in 18 hours regardless of whether you leave peacefully or not. Every integrated world is going to receive detailed instructions for manufacturing quantum viruses, establishing autonomous communication networks, and organizing resistance cells. The longer you stay, the more time they have to prepare. Captain Tanaka gestured toward his assembled colleagues. This has been educational for all of us, Commander. We've learned a lot about consortium capabilities and limitations. I suspect our next encounter will be quite different from this one. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. The humans were not simply rejecting integration, they were actively gathering intelligence for future conflicts. Every moment the consortium remained in the system provided humanity with additional information about consortium technology, tactics, and vulnerabilities. Morrison extended his hand in what Vexthali's cultural database identified as a traditional human gesture of respectful departure. Commander, I hope this is the beginning of a new relationship between our peoples. Not as master and servant, but as independent civilizations with mutual interests. The choice is yours. Vexthali stared at the extended hand for a long moment. To accept it would be to acknowledge humanity as equals, to implicitly recognize their right to reject integration, to validate the very concept of voluntary cooperation that threatened everything the consortium represented. To reject it would be to confirm that the consortium viewed all other species as inherently inferior, existing solely to serve the purposes of their technological superiors. It would validate every argument the resistance network was making about consortium intentions and methods. Either choice carried enormous implications for the future of galactic politics. After a moment that seemed to stretch across centuries of consortium dominance, Vexthali reached out and briefly clasped the human leader's hand. Secretary General Morrison, this matter will require extensive consideration by the Consortium Council. We will communicate our decision through appropriate diplomatic channels. Morrison smiled, and, for the first time, the expression seemed genuinely warm rather than strategically calculated. We look forward to hearing from you, Commander. Travel safely. As Vexthali and her diplomatic team returned to their ship, she found herself fundamentally reconsidering everything she thought she understood about power, hierarchy, and the nature of civilization itself. The humans had demonstrated that technological superiority was not automatically equivalent to social or political dominance. They had shown that resistance was possible even against overwhelming odds. Most disturbingly, they had proven that the carefully constructed logic of consortium expansion could be not just challenged, but casually dismissed by a species that simply refused to accept its premises. The ship's departure was smooth and efficient, but Vexthali noticed that human monitoring systems tracked their movement with sophisticated precision throughout their exit from the system. The primitives had capabilities they had not disclosed during the diplomatic encounter. How much more did they know that they had not revealed? As Earth dwindled to a point of light behind them, Vexthali began composing her report to the Consortium Council. How did one explain that a technologically inferior species had not merely rejected integration, but had somehow turned the encounter into a recruitment opportunity for a galactic resistance movement? How did one convey that humanity had looked at the pinnacle of galactic civilization and simply said no? The quantum virus had indeed disabled fleet coordination systems, forcing a disorganized retreat that would be visible to every monitoring station within several light-years. The mighty consortium fleet, reduced to individual ships limping home like survivors of a naval disaster. But, perhaps most troubling of all was the growing realization that the humans might be right about the fundamental sustainability of consortium civilization. If order could only be maintained through coercion, if progress required the subjugation of others, if the entire structure depended on the acceptance of inequality by those at the bottom of the hierarchy, what happened when those at the bottom simply refused to accept their assigned position? The answer was spreading through quantum communication networks across 43 star systems, carried by a species that had looked at the natural order of the galaxy and decided to write their own rules instead. In her private quarters, reviewing the day's events for her official report, Vexthali found herself returning again and again to the human leader's final words: "The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others." She was beginning to understand that humanity had not simply rejected consortium integration, they had rejected the very concept of being owned, controlled, or dominated by anyone. They had killed the part of themselves that might have accepted subjugation, and, in doing so, had made themselves immune to the fundamental logic upon which the consortium was built. The implications of that transformation were still spreading through the galaxy, carried on quantum frequencies that consortium technology could not monitor or control. Somewhere in the vast network of integrated worlds, other species were receiving detailed instructions for achieving the same immunity to domination that humanity had demonstrated. The age of automatic submission to technological superiority was ending, and Commander Vexthali had been present at its funeral. The humans had not simply said no to the consortium, they had said no to the entire concept of cosmic hierarchy, and they had provided every other species in the galaxy with the tools to say the same thing. As her ship crossed into consortium space, Vexthali realized she was returning home to report the beginning of the end of everything her civilization had been built upon. The humans had destroyed their weak selves, and, in doing so, had begun the process of destroying the weak selves of every species that had accepted domination as the price of survival in a hostile galaxy. The revolution would not be violent. It would not require massive fleets or devastating weapons. It would simply require every subjugated species to remember what the humans had never forgotten, that the right to exist as equals was not something that had to be earned or granted. It was something that could be claimed by anyone brave enough to destroy the part of themselves that accepted anything less. And, once that process began, once species after species rediscovered their own capacity for independence and self-determination, no amount of technological superiority would be enough to hold the old order together. The galaxy was about to become a much more interesting place.